Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The coffee had turned bitter and cold hours ago, but Dr. Caelum Draxler barely registered its taste as he took another sip from the ceramic mug that bore the faded logo of the James Webb Observatory. The digital clock in the corner of his workstation glowed a pale blue 11:47 p.m. its light reflecting off his wire-rimmed glasses and casting angular shadows across his gaunt features. At 44, Caelum had spent more nights alone in this facility than most people spent awake in a year, but tonight carried a weight that pressed against his chest like a physical presence. The building around him had settled into its nocturnal rhythm, creaking and sighing as metal contracted in the desert cold. Somewhere in the mechanical depths below, cooling systems hummed their electronic mantras, while the wind outside whispered through gaps in the observatory's aging infrastructure. These sounds had once been comforting, the familiar lullaby of scientific solitude, but now they seemed muted and distant, as if the very air had grown thick with anticipation. Caelum preferred these late hours when the chatter of his colleagues had faded, and the endless parade of meetings, peer reviews, and administrative obligations finally ceased. In the darkness, he could pursue the questions that made department heads uncomfortable and grant committees nervous. Questions about what lay beyond the observable universe. Questions about why certain cosmic formations seemed too deliberate, too precisely arranged to be the product of random chance. Questions that his more cautious colleagues dismissed as the dangerous territory where legitimate science dissolved into speculation and professional suicide. His current assignment was routine, deep field analysis, the kind of tedious but necessary work that formed the backbone of modern astronomy. Sector designation JW 7749X represented one of the most distant regions Webb had ever captured, a slice of space so far from Earth that the light reaching the telescope had begun its journey when the universe was still an infant, hot and dense and unrecognizable. Standard protocol called for quick analysis and systematic filing of these images. Most contained nothing more than cosmic background radiation, the faint afterglow of creation itself, occasionally punctuated by the ghostly light of primordial galaxies caught in their youth. But something in the visual static of sector JW 7749X had caught Caelum's attention 3 hours ago, a subtle asymmetry in what should have been random distribution of ancient photons. At first glance, it appeared to be standard instrumental noise, the kind of digital artifacts that plagued even the most sophisticated space telescopes. Random pixel variations, thermal fluctuations in the sensor array, perhaps interference from a passing satellite. But as Caelum enhanced the resolution and adjusted the contrast filters with the methodical patience of a man who had spent his career coaxing secrets from the cosmos, something impossible began to emerge from the static. The coffee mug slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, its ceramic surface shattering against the concrete floor and sending cold liquid splashing across scattered papers and equipment manuals. He didn't notice. His entire world had contracted to the impossible image, crystallizing on his monitor with each adjustment of the enhancement algorithms. A structure stretched across the void at the very edge of observable space, but structure was an inadequate word for what he was seeing. This was architecture on a scale that dwarfed solar systems, engineering that treated light years as mere building materials, not the chaotic debris of stellar formation or the elegant spirals of distant galaxies, but something that could only be described as deliberately, impossibly, magnificently artificial. Towering spires pierced the cosmic darkness like frozen screams given form, their surfaces reflecting starlight in ways that suggested polished stone or metal worked with techniques beyond human comprehension. Each spire was larger than Earth's orbit around the sun, yet they appeared as delicate as cathedral spires from this unimaginable distance. Vast bridges arched between them, connecting structures so massive that gas giants could have rolled through their doorways like marbles. The level of detail visible even at this incomprehensible distance suggested craftsmanship that had been refined over geological epochs. Balconies jutted from spire walls in precise mathematical arrangements. Windows large enough to contain entire star systems gazed out into the void with the blank stare of cosmic eyes, uncovering every visible surface etched with the precision of laser engraving into materials harder than diamond, were intricate designs that seemed almost familiar despite their alien origin. Caelum's hands trembled as he initiated higher resolution scans, pushing Webb's instruments to their absolute limits. The structure revealed itself in layers, each magnification unveiling new depths of impossible complexity. Architectural elements nested within one another, like cosmic fractals, creating patterns that seemed to extend infinitely inward. Doorways opened onto balconies that connected to bridges that led to chambers that housed smaller versions of the entire structure, each one perfect in its detail despite being no larger than Earth's moon. The rational part of his mind tried desperately to rationalize what he was seeing. Pareidolia, perhaps, the human tendency to see patterns and faces in random configurations. But as he ran the images through various analytical filters, checking for instrumental artifacts and processing errors, the structure only became more defined, more undeniably real. The spectral analysis confirmed that it was reflecting actual starlight, not generating false signals. The gravitational lensing effects were consistent with massive physical objects occupying space. Every test he could devise confirmed the same impossible conclusion. Someone had built this monument at the dawn of time itself, when the universe was young and malleable, and the first stars were still condensing from primordial gas. The construction must have required resources and energy on scales that made stellar engineering look like child's play. Entire galaxies' worth of matter had been refined and shaped and assembled into this cosmic cathedral, positioned at the very edge of space where it could observe the entire universe spreading out below like a vast garden. As he saved the enhanced images to his private encrypted drive, labeling them with timestamps and technical specifications that seemed absurdly mundane, given their world-shattering implications, a strange sensation washed over him, like ice water flowing through his veins. The sterile walls of the observatory dissolved around him, replaced by corridors of black stone that stretched away into impossible distances. Ancient starlight filtered through crystalline windows the size of continents, casting shifting rainbow patterns across floors, polished to mirror brightness. The air tasted of ozone and something else, something organic and ancient that suggested vast spaces filled with patient breathing. Footsteps echoed in the distance, too measured and too heavy to be human, accompanied by a sound like wind chimes made from the bones of extinct civilizations. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left him dizzy and nauseous, as if he'd been physically transported across impossible distances and then snapped back to his own reality like a rubber band. He gripped the edge of his desk until the sensation passed, telling himself it was nothing more than fatigue and stress, the inevitable result of too many late nights and too much caffeine. But even as he rationalized the experience, he made a decision that would seal his fate and doom everyone he'd ever cared about. This discovery was too important, too potentially catastrophic, to share prematurely. The implications were staggering. Proof of intelligence that predated human civilization by billions of years. technology that could manipulate matter and energy on cosmic scales, the suggestion that humanity was not alone and had never been alone in the universe. Such knowledge could shatter existing religious and philosophical frameworks, trigger global panic, or be suppressed by governments and institutions that preferred manageable ignorance to transformative truth. He needed time to understand what he was looking at, to develop theories about its origin and purpose, to prepare humanity for a revelation that would change everything. Until then, the secret would be his alone to bear. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of obsession and discovery that consumed him more completely than any addiction. Caelum abandoned his usual routine of going home to his empty apartment, sleeping in his own bed, maintaining the pretense of a life outside the observatory. Instead, he established a makeshift camp in his office, subsisting on energy drinks and whatever food he could scavenge from the building's vending machines during the brief intervals when he remembered that his body required sustenance. His workspace transformed into something that would have alarmed any observer had there been anyone left to observe him. Computer screens displayed dozens of enhanced images at various magnifications and spectral frequencies, each one revealing new architectural details that defied human comprehension. Printed photographs covered every available surface of his office: walls, filing cabinets, even the floor, connected by lengths of red string that traced relationships and patterns only he could perceive. His usually meticulous handwriting devolved into desperate scratches as he tried to catalogue the structure's vast architectural elements. Notebooks filled with sketches of spires and bridges, doorways and chambers, all rendered with a precision that surprised him. He had never considered himself particularly artistic, but the drawings flowed from his pen with a fluency that suggested muscle memory of places he'd never been. The enhancement software ran continuously, pushing Webb's data through every analytical filter he could access. False color images revealed thermal signatures that suggested the structure was not entirely cold and dead. Gravitational measurements detected subtle but consistent variations that implied the presence of massive objects moving within the architecture. Even more disturbing, the structure appeared to be growing, adding new elements with glacial slowness but undeniable purpose. Dr. Mirek Halstrad found him there on Thursday afternoon, slumped over his keyboard in the midst of what looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Halstrad was a practical man in his 60s, weathered by decades of managing brilliant but eccentric scientists who occasionally lost themselves in their work. He'd seen researchers disappear into theoretical rabbit holes, become obsessed with fringe theories, even suffer complete nervous breakdowns under the pressure of cosmic insignificance. But he'd never seen anything quite like the transformation that had overtaken his most reliable researcher. "Caelum, you look like hell." Halstrad's voice carried the careful tone of someone addressing a potentially unstable individual. "When's the last time you went home? Your research assistants haven't seen you in days. You've missed 3 department meetings this week, and the funding review committee is asking where your quarterly report is." Caelum looked up from his screens, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light like a nocturnal creature dragged into unwanted daylight. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken, surrounded by dark circles that spoke of days without sleep. His usually neat beard had grown wild and unkempt, and his clothes were wrinkled and stained with coffee and the mysterious detritus of obsession. "I'm onto something, Mirek." His voice was hoarse from disuse, barely above a whisper. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about the universe. I just need more time to verify the findings before I present them to the world." "What kind of findings? You're being secretive, and that's not like you. In 20 years of working together, you've never hidden your research from me. Show me what's got you so worked up." "Not yet." The words came out sharper than Caelum intended, carrying an edge of paranoia that surprised both men. His hands moved protectively over the keyboard, as if Halstrad might try to access his files by force. "Soon, but not yet. I need to be absolutely certain before this goes public. The implications are too enormous for mistakes." Halstrad studied his colleague's hollow eyes and trembling hands with growing alarm. He'd seen researchers crack before, usually under the weight of failed experiments or devastating peer reviews. But this was different. Caelum looked like a man who'd seen something that human minds weren't meant to process, something that had fundamentally altered his relationship with reality itself. "Caelum, you're scaring me. Whatever you think you've discovered, it's not worth destroying your health over. You haven't eaten a proper meal in days, you haven't slept, and you're starting to smell like a homeless person. Take a break, go home, get some sleep, shower, and we'll review your work together tomorrow." But Caelum had already returned his attention to the screens, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as he pulled up new image sequences and enhancement protocols. The conversation might as well have been happening in another room or another universe, for all the attention he paid to his supervisor's concerns. Halstrad stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching his friend and colleague disappear deeper into whatever obsession had claimed him, before finally leaving with visible frustration and the uncomfortable knowledge that intervention might soon become necessary. That night, the visions intensified beyond anything Caelum could dismiss as mere fatigue or stress-induced hallucinations. In his dreams, if they could still be called dreams when the boundary between sleep and waking had become so thoroughly blurred, he walked through cathedral-sized chambers lined with towering statues of beings that might once have been alive but were now preserved in stone or metal or some material that combined the properties of both. The figures stood in perfect rows that extended beyond the limits of sight, each one slightly different from the others, in ways that suggested individuality rather than mass production. Some held objects that defied identification, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change when observed peripherally, tools whose purpose escaped human comprehension despite their obvious sophistication. Others simply stood with their arms raised towards the invisible ceiling in gestures that might have been supplication, command, or some emotion for which human language lacked adequate terms. Their faces had been worn smooth by eons of cosmic wind and radiation, but their postures conveyed personalities that transcended mere physical form. Some stood straight and proud, others slumped with what might have been weariness or despair. A few appeared to be turning toward him as he passed, following his movement with eyeless gazes that seemed to penetrate his soul and find it somehow wanting. Between the statues, narrow pathways led deeper into the structure through spaces that defied three-dimensional geometry. Caelum found himself compelled to follow them, his footsteps echoing in the vast chambers with a sound like distant thunder rolling across empty plains. The paths branched and intersected in ways that hurt to contemplate, leading him through chambers that couldn't possibly fit within the structure's exterior dimensions, yet somehow contained infinities of architectural detail. The walls were covered with murals carved directly into whatever material composed the structure's framework. The images depicted scenes from countless worlds, showing the rise and fall of civilizations that spanned millions of years and developed technologies that made human achievement look like the scratching of insects in sand. But all of them followed similar patterns: the discovery of fire, the development of agriculture, the emergence of cities and then global civilizations, the first tentative reaches towards the stars. In many scenes, the civilizations were not alone. Vast hands descended from above, sometimes gently guiding, sometimes ruthlessly pruning, always shaping the development of intelligence according to some incomprehensible design. The hands belonged to beings so large that individual fingers were portrayed as landscape features, mountains that moved with purpose and reshaped entire continents according to aesthetic principles beyond mortal understanding. Caelum woke Friday morning on his office couch, his body stiff and aching as if he'd actually spent hours walking through impossible spaces. His journal lay open beside him, filled with architectural sketches he had no memory of creating, but which matched perfectly with the enhanced web images displayed on his monitors. The drawings showed details he'd never consciously observed: the internal structure of individual spires, the connecting mechanisms between major architectural elements, even the patterns of erosion and maintenance that suggested the structure was actively cared for by entities whose scale made humans look like bacteria. The accuracy of the sketches was deeply disturbing. Every line, every architectural detail, every decorative element matched the telescope data with precision that should have been impossible. He was reproducing information from sources he'd never accessed, creating technical drawings of structures he'd never studied, all while in a state that might charitably be called sleep, but felt more like communion with something vast and patient and utterly alien. As Friday wore on, and his analysis of the structure deepened, an even more unsettling pattern emerged from the data. The symbols covering the structure's surfaces weren't entirely foreign to human experience. Variations of them appeared in ancient architecture around the world, carved into stone monuments and earthwork formations that predated recorded history by thousands of years. The spirals etched into the cosmic structure's spires bore striking similarities to the Neolithic carvings at Newgrange in Ireland. The geometric patterns covering the vast bridges echoed the designs found at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a site so old that it challenged conventional theories about the development of human civilization. Even the arrangement of the smaller surrounding structures seemed to mirror the positioning of megalithic sites across Europe and Asia, as if ancient humans had been unconsciously reproducing architectural elements they'd glimpsed in dreams or visions. The correlation was undeniable, but its implications challenged everything Caelum thought he understood about human development and cultural evolution. How could isolated civilizations separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles develop identical symbolic languages? What force could have influenced architectural traditions across completely disconnected cultures? The only logical conclusion was one that his rational mind rejected with every fibre of its scientific training. Humanity had been in contact with this structure's builders long before developing the technology to detect their presence. The contact hadn't been physical. Distances and timeframes made that impossible, but some form of communication had occurred. Dreams perhaps, or genetic memories encoded so deeply in human DNA that they surfaced as cultural archetypes and architectural instincts. The builders had been shaping human development from the very beginning, guiding civilization along paths that served their incomprehensible purposes. Sleep became not just difficult, but actively dangerous. Every time Caelum closed his eyes, he found himself transported to that enormous cathedral, where the ceiling was a tapestry of dead stars, arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate. The space was so vast that atmospheric perspective couldn't reach the walls. They simply faded into infinite distance like the edge of a flat earth dropping away into cosmic void. The floor beneath his feet was a mosaic of polished stone slabs, each one inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. The writing covered every surface in dense layers that suggested multiple languages, or perhaps a single language so complex that it could express concepts human minds weren't equipped to understand. Some symbols pulsed with their own inner light, while others seemed to absorb photons from the starlight above, creating patches of absolute darkness that served as punctuation in sentences written across geological scales. But the ceiling was the element that filled him with existential terror. The dead stars hung there like cosmic chandeliers, but they weren't random points of light. They had been arranged into recognizable constellations from Earth's night sky: the Big Dipper, Orion, the Southern Cross, as if someone had plucked familiar stars from their positions in space and assembled them into decorative patterns billions of light years away. The implication was staggering. Whoever built this structure had intimate knowledge of Earth's sky, detailed enough to recreate human constellations, in an alien cathedral at the edge of the universe. The weekend passed in a blur of analysis and growing dread. Caelum's rational mind, trained by decades of scientific methodology and peer review, fought desperately against conclusions that violated everything he'd been taught about the nature of reality. But the evidence continued to accumulate with each passing hour, building an undeniable case for the existence of intelligence so ancient and powerful that human civilization was less than a footnote in its history. The structure was not a ruin, as he'd initially assumed. Thermal imaging revealed subtle temperature variations that suggested active maintenance systems operating within the architecture. Gravitational measurements detected massive objects moving through the interior spaces with glacial slowness but undeniable purpose. Most disturbing of all, the structure appeared to be growing, adding new elements at a rate so slow that change was only detectable when comparing images taken hours apart. By Monday morning, Caelum's appearance had deteriorated to the point where colleagues actively avoided him in the hallways. His eyes were bloodshot and haunted, darting constantly towards shadows and corners, as if he expected to see architectural elements from his visions materializing in the real world. His hands shook with a fine tremor that made it difficult to operate equipment or write legible notes. His clothes hadn't been changed in days, and he'd developed an odor that combined stale sweat with something else, something organic and alien that seemed to cling to him like invisible smoke. When Dr. Halstrad summoned him to his office that morning, Caelum knew the confrontation was inevitable, but he was beyond caring about professional consequences or institutional politics. The structure at the edge of forever had become his entire reality, more real and immediate than the mundane concerns of academic careers and peer approval. "This has gone far enough," Halstrad said, gesturing to a folder of printed screenshots he'd somehow obtained from Caelum's workstation. The images showed enhanced views of the cosmic structure, annotated with notes and calculations that read like the ravings of a madman. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're destroying yourself chasing phantom signals and cosmic conspiracy theories. This research is hereby classified as an instrumentation error. Archive everything and return to your assigned projects immediately." "You can't classify reality as an error, Mirek." Caelum's voice was steadier than it had been in days, carrying a certainty that was more disturbing than his previous agitation. "I've found proof that we're not alone in the universe, that we never have been alone. Something has been watching us, guiding our development for thousands of years. The implications go beyond astronomy or physics. They touch every aspect of human existence." "The implications are dangerous," Halstrad snapped, his patience finally exhausted by days of watching his colleagues' descent into obsession. "Do you want this observatory to become a laughingstock? Do you want every conspiracy theorist and UFO enthusiast in the world camping on our doorstep, demanding access to your proof of alien intervention? I won't let your breakdown destroy the credibility we've spent decades building. This isn't a breakdown, this is the most important discovery in human history, and you want to bury it because it doesn't fit your comfortable assumptions about how the universe works. This is a man who hasn't slept in a week seeing patterns that don't exist. You're suffering from classic symptoms of research-induced psychosis, paranoid ideation, social isolation, grandiose delusions about the significance of your work. Go home, Caelum, get professional help. When you're thinking clearly again, we'll discuss your future here." The words washed over Caelum like water over stone. Halstrad's concerns belonged to a smaller, simpler universe where the biggest questions involved stellar formation rates and galactic evolution models. He couldn't understand that some discoveries were too large to be contained within institutional frameworks, too transformative to be hidden behind academic caution. "I'm taking this to the media," Caelum said quietly. "If you won't let me publish through official channels, I'll find other ways to get the truth out." If you do that, your career is over. Not just here, but everywhere. No legitimate institution will touch you after you've publicly associated yourself with fringe theories and conspiracy thinking. Then I'll work alone. Halstrad watched his friend and colleague walk away, noting the slight stagger in his gait and the way his hands trembled as he reached for the door handle. The conversation had accomplished nothing except to confirm his worst fears about Caelum's mental state. Intervention would be necessary, probably involving security and medical personnel, but it would have to wait until he could document the full extent of the breakdown for legal protection. Desperate and increasingly isolated from the academic community that had been his entire adult life, Caelum made a decision that his rational mind would have rejected just a week earlier. He would seek out Ilas Veayner, a former colleague who had left astrophysics 5 years ago under circumstances that had never been fully explained to the rest of the department. Ilas had been brilliant, perhaps more so than Caelum himself, with an intuitive grasp of cosmic mechanics that bordered on the supernatural. His theoretical work on dark matter distribution and cosmic background radiation anomalies had been groundbreaking, earning him offers from every major observatory in the world. But at the height of his career, he'd suddenly abandoned everything. His research, his position, even his apartment near the university, and disappeared into the mountains outside the city. The official story was that he'd suffered a nervous breakdown triggered by professional stress and the existential weight of cosmological research. Depression and anxiety were common among astronomers, who spent their careers contemplating scales of space and time that rendered human existence laughably insignificant. But Caelum had always suspected there was more to Ilas's departure than simple mental health issues. There had been rumours of strange behaviour in the weeks before he left, reports of him working through the night and muttering in unknown languages, sketching architectural diagrams that bore no resemblance to any earthly construction. The drive to Ilas's mountain cabin took nearly 3 hours along increasingly remote roads that wound through pine forests and granite outcroppings. Cell phone coverage disappeared after the first hour, and GPS signals became intermittent as the terrain interfered with satellite communication. By the time Caelum reached the final turn onto a dirt track that was barely more than a deer path, he was beginning to wonder if the address he'd tracked down through old university records was even accurate. The cabin sat in a clearing that felt deliberately isolated from the modern world. Solar panels provided power, and a satellite dish suggested some form of internet connectivity, but the structure itself looked like something from an earlier century. Log walls chinked with mortar, a stone chimney trailing wood smoke into the crisp mountain air, and windows that reflected the surrounding forest like watching eyes. Ilas answered the door before Caelum could knock, as if he'd been expecting the visit. The years had changed him dramatically, transforming the clean-cut academic Caelum remembered into something that looked more like a hermit or mountain mystic. His dark hair had gone completely white, and his once clean-shaven face was hidden behind a thick beard that reached nearly to his chest. But his eyes were the same, still sharp and intelligent, though now carrying a weight of knowledge that seemed almost unbearable. "You heard them too," Ilas said simply, stepping aside to let Caelum enter. The cabin's interior was a shrine to mysteries that mainstream academia preferred to ignore. Books on mythology, archaeology, and comparative religion filled every available surface, their spines bearing titles in languages Caelum couldn't identify. Maps covered the walls, marked with coloured pins that seemed to indicate prehistoric sites around the world: Stonehenge, the pyramids, Easter Island, Machu Picchu, and dozens of others connected by lines that suggested some vast global pattern. But most disturbing were the notebooks scattered across every horizontal surface. Hundreds of them, their pages filled with the same architectural sketches that had been pouring from Caelum's pen. Detailed drawings of spires and bridges, chambers and corridors, all rendered with an accuracy that suggested direct observation rather than imagination. "You're not the first to receive the transmissions," Ilas continued, settling into a worn armchair beside a fireplace where logs crackled with homey warmth that seemed utterly at odds with the cosmic horror implicit in their conversation. "I started hearing them in 2018, long before Webb achieved full operational status. That's when I knew I had to leave the field. The sky has always been watching, Caelum. I just couldn't handle the knowledge of being watched back." "But how is that possible? The technology didn't exist to detect signals from that distance before Webb was launched." "Who says we detected them through technology?" Ilas pulled out one of his journals, its pages yellowed and filled with architectural drawings that matched perfectly with the images on Caelum's computer screens. "I started creating these sketches 3 years before Webb's first light. The dreams, the visions, the sensation of walking through those endless halls. It began the moment I started seriously studying deep space for anomalies in the cosmic microwave background." Caelum felt reality shifting around him like sand. Everything he'd believed about scientific methodology and observational astronomy was crumbling, replaced by implications that violated the fundamental assumptions of rational inquiry. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the instruments don't detect the signal. The signal detects us. When we look deep enough into space, when we ask the right questions about what lies beyond the observable universe, we attract their attention. Webb didn't discover that structure. It simply provided a lens for seeing what was already trying to make contact." The evening passed in a blur of shared experiences and corroborated impossibilities. Both men had been drawn to study cosmic background radiation. Both had experienced the same vivid dreams of walking through the vast structure. Both had found themselves creating detailed architectural drawings of places they'd never seen. The correlation was so perfect that it ruled out coincidence or independent hallucination. "What are they?" Caelum asked as the fire burned low and shadows gathered in the cabin's corners. "Ancient doesn't begin to describe them. They were old when the universe was young, already building at the edges of space while the first stars were still condensing from primordial gas. I think they're gardeners, Caelum, cosmic architects who plant seeds of civilization and then wait to see what grows. And humanity is one of their crops. Look at the evidence. Every major human civilization has built monuments that echo their architectural style. The pyramids, the megaliths, the temple complexes scattered across every inhabited continent. They're all variations on themes we're only now seeing in their original form. Our ancestors weren't building random religious structures or astronomical observatories. They were following blueprints encoded in their dreams, responding to signals that reached Earth long before we developed the technology to detect them consciously. Then why reveal themselves now? Why after all these millennia of hidden influence? Ilas's expression grew darker, his eyes reflecting firelight in ways that made them look like tiny stars burning in deep space. Because the harvest is ready. Humanity has reached the point where we can consciously perceive their presence, which means we've passed some threshold they've been waiting for. The question is whether we're ready for adoption into their community of intelligence, or if we're about to be pruned away like weeds in a garden. The next morning brought the first signs that Ilas's dire predictions were beginning to manifest in the physical world. Reports flooded in from news agencies around the globe of unprecedented natural phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Along the coasts of 3 continents, tidal waters were receding far beyond normal ranges, revealing previously unknown structures on the ocean floor that matched known geological formations. Satellite imagery showed the structures clearly during the unusual low tides. Black stone obelisks arranged in geometric patterns that echoed the designs covering the cosmic structure at the universe's edge. The constructions were clearly artificial, showing tool marks and architectural details that suggested sophisticated engineering techniques, but their temporary nature was deeply disturbing. When normal tide patterns returned, no trace of the structures remained visible, as if they existed in a state of quantum superposition, becoming real only when conditions were precisely aligned. Underwater archaeological teams dispatched to investigate during subsequent low tides found nothing but natural sediment and marine life. Sonar scans detected no anomalies, and core samples revealed normal geological stratification dating back millions of years. The structures appeared to exist only when they could be directly observed, vanishing into some parallel dimension when human attention turned elsewhere. Even more alarming were the reports coming from astronomical observatories worldwide. Entire star clusters were disappearing from the night sky, not exploding or collapsing according to known stellar evolution models, but simply winking out of existence as if someone had thrown switches to turn them off. The missing stars followed no natural pattern. They weren't clustered in any particular region of space or stellar classification. They seemed to be chosen deliberately, removed from the cosmic tapestry like pieces being cleared from a game board to make room for new arrangements. Within a week, 47 star systems had vanished from human observation. The astronomical community was in chaos, with competing theories ranging from mass black hole formation to systematic instrumentation failures across every major observatory on Earth. Peer-reviewed papers were rushed to publication proposing exotic physics and unprecedented cosmic events, but none of the explanations adequately addressed the scope and precision of the disappearances. Caelum and Ilas knew the truth that the scientific establishment couldn't accept. The cosmic architects were preparing for something, clearing their view of obstacles or distractions that might interfere with whatever they had planned for Earth. The universe was being redecorated according to aesthetic principles the human minds couldn't comprehend, with entire solar systems serving as nothing more than lighting elements in a vast architectural design. The most widespread and disturbing manifestation was the sound that began affecting every inhabited continent simultaneously. It wasn't heard in the traditional sense, but felt as a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the Earth itself. The frequency was below the threshold of normal human hearing, but it penetrated bone and tissue with effects that ranged from mild discomfort to complete psychological breakdown. Sleep studies conducted at universities around the world revealed that the vibration matched human brainwave patterns during the deepest stages of REM sleep, as if something was trying to synchronize with humanity's subconscious rhythms. EEG monitoring showed that exposure to the frequency-induced dream states, even in waking subjects, causing vivid hallucinations that often involved architectural elements matching those found in the cosmic structure. Caelum experienced these effects more directly than most. He found himself speaking fragments of an unknown language without conscious awareness, words that seemed to bypass normal linguistic processing and resonate directly in the listener's mind. His research assistant had mentioned during one of their brief meetings that he'd been muttering continuously in what sounded like an ancient dialect, creating vocal patterns that were simultaneously beautiful and deeply disturbing. When Caelum tried to remember what he'd said, or even what the words meant, they slipped away like water through his fingers. But he could feel their meaning at some level deeper than rational thought, concepts that human language lacked adequate terms to express. The words described architectural principles based on folded space-time, engineering techniques that worked by convincing matter to behave according to different physical laws, aesthetic theories that treated entire galaxies as decorative elements in cosmic compositions. His dreams evolved beyond mere architectural tours into something that felt more like education or indoctrination. The vast murals carved into the cathedral walls now moved like living things, depicting the history of countless worlds across eons of cosmic time. He watched civilizations rise and fall, developed technologies that transcended human understanding, and eventually merged with the community of intelligence that spanned the galaxy like a neural network made of stars. The scenes weren't random or chaotic, but followed clear developmental patterns. Every species began with fire and agriculture, progressed through industrialization and space exploration, and eventually reached a critical threshold where they became aware of the Watchers at the edge of forever. Some species passed the test and were adopted into the greater civilization. Others were deemed unsuitable and quietly pruned away, their worlds sterilized and recycled as raw materials for future experiments. Physical manifestations began appearing on Caelum's body with increasing frequency and precision. He woke one morning to find deep bruises circling his wrists, perfectly symmetrical and far too large to have been made by human hands. The marks were precisely placed, as if something had grasped him with scientific accuracy during his sleep, lifting and examining him with the careful attention of a researcher studying a laboratory specimen. Over the following days, similar bruises appeared on his ankles, shoulders, and around his torso. Each set was perfectly matched, suggesting that he'd been handled by entities with multiple limbs or appendages working in perfect coordination. The bruises didn't hurt exactly, but they carried a sensation of lingering presence, as if invisible hands were still touching him, even in his waking hours. More disturbing was his increasing fluency in the unknown language. He began unconsciously writing in symbols that matched those covering the cosmic structure, filling page after page with text he couldn't consciously read, but somehow understood at a level that bypassed rational thought. The writing described concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about physics and cosmology, methods for folding space-time like origami, techniques for convincing matter to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, aesthetic principles that treated the cosmic microwave background as a canvas for artistic expression on universal scales. 3 weeks after the transmissions began, Webb captured an image that shattered any remaining hope that humanity was dealing with a passive archaeological discovery. The cosmic structure had changed, revealing itself to be something far more complex than static architecture. A gateway spanning multiple light years had begun to open at the structure's heart, but the process was unlike anything in human experience or theoretical physics. Space itself was bending and twisting to accommodate the opening, creating gravitational anomalies that affected star systems thousands of light years away. The gateway wasn't simply a doorway or portal. It was a fundamental alteration in the nature of reality, a surgical incision in the fabric of existence that allowed passage between dimensions that occupied the same space but existed in completely different states of being. The process was visible across multiple spectral frequencies as exotic matter poured through the opening like luminous blood from a cosmic wound. Webb's instruments detected particles that violated known conservation laws, energy patterns that suggested the gateway was drawing power from sources that existed outside the observable universe. The readings were so far beyond human physics that they might as well have been magic, technologies that treated fundamental constants like adjustable parameters in some vast cosmic equation. Beyond the gateway, light poured out with such intensity that it overwhelmed Webb's sensors, even at maximum filtration. The illumination wasn't simple electromagnetic radiation, but something more complex, carrying information encoded in frequencies that human instruments could detect but not decode. In the brief moments when the imaging systems could compensate for the overwhelming brilliance, massive silhouettes were visible against the background of impossible light. The builders were stirring after eons of patient dormancy. The silhouettes moved with deliberate slowness that suggested vast size rather than lethargy. Individual figures appeared to be larger than Jupiter, composed of materials that reflected light in ways that suggested both organic tissue and manufactured substances. They possessed geometries that hurt to contemplate directly, with appendages and sensory organs arranged according to principles that violated three-dimensional space. Yet, their movements carried an unmistakable quality of intelligence and purpose, the careful precision of entities accustomed to working with scales that treated solar systems as construction materials. As more figures became visible through the gateway, the electromagnetic disturbances affecting Earth intensified beyond anything human technology could compensate for. Satellites failed in cascading sequences as their electronics were overwhelmed by radiation that operated according to physics humanity hadn't discovered. The exotic particles streaming from the gateway interacted with Earth's magnetosphere in ways that created aurora displays visible even in daylight, sheets of coloured light that danced across the sky in patterns too organised to be natural. Power grids began failing across entire continents as induced currents overwhelmed protective systems designed for natural phenomena. The surges followed no predictable pattern. They seemed to target specific infrastructure elements, while leaving others completely untouched, as if something was selectively disabling human technology according to criteria that made sense only to vast intelligences operating on cosmic scales. Communication networks collapsed under waves of interference that seemed specifically designed to disrupt human connectivity. Radio telescopes around the world detected structured signals that jammed their own frequencies with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of human technology. Internet infrastructure succumbed to data streams that followed no known protocol, carrying information encoded in languages that human computers couldn't parse but somehow recognized as meaningful. Within 72 hours of the gateway's opening, global technological civilization had been effectively neutralized, not destroyed. The damage was too precise for random destruction, but carefully disabled in ways that left basic infrastructure intact, while eliminating humanity's ability to coordinate responses or share information across large distances. It was the work of entities who understood human technology better than humans did, who could disable it with surgical precision while leaving organic life completely unharmed. But the most terrifying change was visible to naked eyes as the night sky began transforming in ways that violated every assumption about stellar mechanics and cosmic stability. Stars that had maintained their positions for millions of years started moving with glacial but undeniable purpose, their motion detectable to careful observers within hours, rather than the geological timescales normally associated with stellar drift. The changes weren't random or chaotic, but followed clear aesthetic principles. Constellations that had guided human navigation for millennia dissolved and reformed into new arrangements that echoed the architectural patterns covering the cosmic structure. The Big Dipper became a spiral that slowly rotated around Polaris. Orion twisted into a geometric mandala that pulsed with subtle rhythm. The Southern Cross reorganized itself into a symbol that perfectly matched the etchings covering the gateway's outer frame. Humanity watched in growing panic as their most fundamental reference points shifted overhead. Navigation systems that depended on stellar positioning became useless, as the stars they tracked moved into configurations that had never existed in recorded history. Ancient monuments aligned with celestial events found themselves pointing at empty space as their target stars migrated to new positions in increasingly alien arrangements. But the truly disturbing aspect was the deliberate nature of the changes. The stars weren't moving randomly. They were being carefully repositioned by forces that could manipulate gravity and stellar mechanics as easily as human gardeners might rearrange flowers in a decorative pattern. The entire visible universe was being transformed into an extension of the cosmic structure, as if the galaxy itself was nothing more than raw material for architectural projects that spanned multiple dimensions. Professor Ansel Ravane worked frantically in his university office, powered by emergency generators that provided just enough electricity to run his translation equipment and maintain communication with the handful of other linguists still attempting to decode the evolving transmissions. The alien signals had grown exponentially more complex as the gateway opened, layering additional voices and harmonic elements into communications that seemed to contain entire libraries of information compressed into acoustic frequencies. His translation software, pushed far beyond its design parameters, struggled to parse syntax and grammar, unlike anything that had evolved on Earth. The alien language didn't follow linear, logical structures, but seemed to communicate through resonance patterns and harmonic relationships that conveyed meaning on multiple levels simultaneously. Individual words carried embedded concepts that would require entire paragraphs to express in human language, while the grammar itself shifted according to emotional context and temporal perspective in ways that suggested minds vastly different from human cognition. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning as dawn revealed a sky where familiar constellations had been replaced by geometric arrangements of unprecedented beauty and terrifying precision. Rouvain's translation algorithms finally achieved a partial decode of the transmission's core message, displaying words on his screen that seemed to carry weight beyond their simple meaning. The watchers rise, the cradle is prepared, the children are ready for adoption. The implications crashed over him like a physical weight, confirming suspicions that had been growing since the first strange signals arrived from the cosmic structure. Humanity had never evolved independently. Earth was not a random planet that had coincidentally developed life through natural processes. It was a carefully maintained nursery world, tended by intelligence so vast and ancient that human civilization was barely a footnote in its patient cultivation of developing species. The cosmic structure wasn't just a monument or communications array. It was the administrative center for a galaxy-spanning project that had been running for billions of years. Every habitable world in the observable universe was part of the same vast experiment, seeded with life and then carefully guided through developmental stages according to criteria that only the Watchers fully understood. The monuments built by ancient human civilizations weren't responses to religious visions or astronomical observations. They were architectural assignments, construction projects designed to test developing species' ability to work with advanced engineering principles. The pyramids, the megaliths, the temple complexes that dotted every inhabited continent were all variations on standardized testing protocols, evaluating humanity's readiness for the next phase of existence. And now the testing period was over. The results had been tabulated by minds that thought in geological timescales, and humanity had been deemed ready for adoption into the galactic community of intelligence. But adoption didn't necessarily mean survival in any form that humans would recognize. Some species might be preserved as they were, valued for their unique perspectives and cultural contributions. Others might be modified or enhanced to better serve the Watchers' incomprehensible purposes, and some might be recycled completely, their biological and cultural materials repurposed as raw materials for future experiments. As global civilization crumbled around him, Caelum made his way back to the observatory through streets filled with abandoned vehicles and darkened buildings. The electromagnetic pulses from the opening gateway had disabled most electronic systems, but the older mechanical instruments at the facility might still function. He needed to see what was happening to Earth from a perspective that wasn't filtered through failing technology and human panic. The building was eerily quiet, its corridors lit only by emergency lighting that cast strange shadows on walls covered with star charts and equipment manuals that had become obsolete overnight. His colleagues had fled days ago when it became clear that something unprecedented was affecting the planet's relationship with the cosmos. Only Caelum remained, drawn by an obsession that had grown beyond professional curiosity into something that felt more like religious calling. The main optical telescope was still operational, its mechanical tracking systems unaffected by the electronic failures that had disabled the computerized instruments. Through the eyepiece, Caelum searched desperately for any sign that the universe he'd known still existed, somewhere beyond the transformations reshaping the night sky. What he saw instead shattered something fundamental in his understanding of reality and humanity's place within it. The familiar star patterns were completely gone, replaced by arrangements so alien that they seemed to actively resist human perception. But as he adjusted the telescope's focus and increased magnification, something far more disturbing came into view than mere stellar rearrangement. Earth itself was visible in the lens, a tiny blue dot suspended in space exactly where it should be, relative to the sun and moon. But it wasn't floating free in the solar system as basic astronomy insisted it must be. The planet was contained within something vast and curved, like a marble held within a cosmic bowl, whose edges extended beyond the telescope's field of view. As Caelum refined the focus and pushed the instrument to its maximum magnification, the horrible truth became undeniably clear. The bowl was an eye, an incomprehensibly massive eye carved from the same black stone as the cosmic structure, with Earth suspended in its pupil like a speck of dust caught in a vast optical organ. The eye was so large that entire solar systems could have orbited within its iris, and the precision of Earth's positioning suggested that it had been placed there deliberately, held in perfect focus for observation that had continued since the dawn of human existence. The realization crashed over him like ice water flooding his nervous system. Every moment of human history had been witnessed and recorded by this ancient intelligence. Every triumph and tragedy, every act of love and violence, every step forward and backward in humanity's long climb toward consciousness had been observed with the patience of geological time and the precision of scientific instrumentation. The eye wasn't malevolent in any human sense of the term. There was no anger or hatred in its vast pupil, no intention to cause suffering for its own sake, but there was also no warmth or recognition of kinship, no acknowledgement that the beings it observed possessed consciousness or autonomy worth respecting. It was the gaze of a scientist studying bacterial cultures, clinical and thorough, and utterly detached from any concern for the subject's individual experiences or desires. Humanity had been cherished and guided, protected from cosmic catastrophes and guided away from developmental dead ends that might have terminated their evolution prematurely. But the care had been that of a farmer tending livestock, or a researcher maintaining laboratory specimens. Humans were valued for their potential contributions to some vast project, not for their intrinsic worth, as conscious beings deserving of respect and self-determination. As he watched, transfixed by the cosmic horror of humanity's true situation, structures began moving within the eye's interior. Not the random drift of debris or natural phenomena, but the deliberate positioning of architectural elements according to some predetermined plan. The cosmic builders were preparing Earth's final examination, arranging the test apparatus that would determine humanity's ultimate fate within their galaxy-spanning civilization. Massive geometric forms descended from the eye's outer regions, each one larger than continents but moving with the precise control of surgical instruments. They positioned themselves around Earth's orbit in configurations that created gravitational effects, detectable even through the telescope's limited magnification. The planet's rotation began to slow as tidal forces from the approaching structures disrupted the delicate balance between Earth's spin and the Sun's gravitational pull. But the changes weren't destructive. They were carefully calibrated to create specific conditions without causing mass extinction or ecological collapse. The entities responsible for this manipulation possessed such complete understanding of planetary mechanics that they could reshape entire worlds while preserving the life forms they had spent eons cultivating. Earth was being prepared for something, optimized according to criteria that human science couldn't begin to comprehend. Caelum stepped back from the telescope, his mind reeling under the weight of revelations that no human consciousness was equipped to process. The words that emerged from his throat came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, spoken in the alien language that had been growing within him since the transmissions began. Fel tarneth corfain, julmeth calavorthak nuldaran. The translation appeared in his mind without conscious effort, carrying meanings that human language could only approximate. We were never the observers, we were the observed, and now the observation phase is ending. In the silence that followed, something vast and patient shifted in the cosmos above. The eye that held Earth in its gaze moved with deliberate slowness, adjusting its focus like a scientist, preparing to examine a particularly interesting specimen under higher magnification. The planet trembled in its gravitational field, responding to forces that operated according to physics beyond human understanding. The buildings around the observatory began to change, their familiar architecture flowing like liquid as matter responded to commands, encoded in frequencies beyond human perception. Walls stretched upward, assuming proportions and angles that defied three-dimensional geometry. Windows expanded into doorways large enough for beings the size of mountains, while the floors developed patterns that matched the symbols covering the cosmic structure at the universe's edge. Caelum realized that the transformation wasn't limited to his immediate surroundings. All across Earth, human architecture was being modified to accommodate visitors, whose scale and nature made normal buildings as useless as dollhouses. Cities were being redesigned by forces that understood both human needs and the requirements of entities whose bodies were composed of organized matter spanning light years. The changes preserved human life while creating spaces suitable for direct contact between species separated by incomprehensible differences in size and composition. For a moment that stretched into subjective eternity, the eye simply watched as Earth's transformation continued. Then, with the careful precision of an entity that had been waiting for geological ages, it blinked. The gesture sent ripples through space-time itself, distorting reality around Earth in ways that human physics couldn't describe or measure. When the eye opened again, the planet had changed position within the vast pupil, not moved in any conventional sense, but translated into a different state of existence that occupied the same space while belonging to an entirely different category of reality. The stars visible from Earth's surface were no longer the familiar points of light that had guided human navigation and inspired countless generations of astronomers and poets. They were something else now, closer, brighter, arranged in patterns that conveyed meaning rather than simply existing as distant suns. The night sky had become a vast manuscript, written in languages of light, telling stories that span millions of years and encompassed the rise and fall of civilizations across the galaxy. In the final moments before human consciousness was gently translated into something more suitable for cosmic citizenship, Caelum understood the true purpose of the James Webb Space Telescope and every other instrument humanity had built to study the universe. They hadn't been constructed to observe distant galaxies or search for signs of life among the stars. They had been built then to provide humanity with the tools needed to announce their readiness for the next phase of existence. Every image captured, every signal detected, every question asked about the nature of the cosmos had been a test of human curiosity and intelligence. The tests had grown progressively more sophisticated as humanity's technology advanced, but they had always been tests, carefully calibrated challenges designed to evaluate developing species' suitability for adoption into the galactic community. And now, having passed the final examination with sufficient competence, humanity was ready to join the community of minds that had been waiting patiently at the edge of forever. The transition would be gentle but complete, preserving what was valuable in human nature, while discarding the limitations that had been necessary during the species' developmental phase. The eye blinked again, slower this time, with something that might have been affection in its vast pupil. the gesture carried the weight of countless eons and the patient satisfaction of a project finally reaching completion. In that cosmic acknowledgement, the universe as humans had known it quietly came to an end, replaced by something far larger and more wondrous than any individual consciousness could contain. In the archives of the cosmic structure, a new file was created with meticulous precision. Species 7,847,293,156 successfully integrated. Status: adopted. Cultural preservation: 87.3% retention of core characteristics. Biological modification: minimal structural enhancement for cosmic scale interaction. New designation: the dreaming builders of the third spiral arm. The gardeners had claimed another harvest, adding humanity's unique perspective to the vast symphony of consciousness that spanned the galaxy like a neural network composed of living stars. Earth would continue to exist, but as something more than a single world. It had become a note in a cosmic composition that treated entire solar systems as instruments in an orchestra, whose music played across dimensions that human language lacked words to describe. And in the spaces between stars, where thought moved at velocities that transcended light and consciousness, existed in forms that no single biological entity could contain, the newest members of the galactic community began to learn their first lessons in the true nature of existence. They discovered that the universe was not empty space punctuated by occasional islands of matter and energy, but a vast living entity whose every component contributed to thoughts and dreams and purposes that spanned eternity. The cosmic structure at the edge of forever continued its patient work, broadcasting signals to younger species still crawling through the early stages of development, guiding them towards the moment when they too would be ready for adoption into the community of minds that filled the universe with consciousness as vast as the space between galaxies and as intimate as the quantum fluctuations that gave birth to reality itself. The Watchers kept their vigil, and the cosmos dreamed its endless dream of intelligence flowering into forms that no single perspective could encompass, but which together gave meaning to existence on scales that dwarfed individual mortality while preserving everything that had ever mattered in forms too beautiful for any one mind to contain. In the end, humanity's greatest discovery was not the cosmic structure or the entities that built it, but the realization that consciousness itself was the fundamental force that shaped reality, and that becoming part of something larger didn't mean losing individual identity, but finding ways to express that identity within symphonies of thought that played across dimensions, where every star was a note and every world was a voice in choruses that sang the universe into increasingly complex and beautiful forms of existence. The observation phase had indeed ended. The participation phase was just beginning,